Welcome to the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast, where we explore the spirituality of the Christian child through the method of the catechesis of the Good Shepherd. I am your host, Carrie Mecki Lozano. So today we are continuing our Season 5 journey of exploring Montessori concept of freedom and responsibility. And so we have Pilar and Anna on the podcast to really dive into what does freedom and responsibility look like for the second plain child. So this is the 6 to 12-year-old who we serve in our level 2 and our level 3 atria. And how our work in CGS in the atria really aids this development of freedom and responsibility and independence in the child. So Pilar is an AMI certified guide for both primary and elementary levels in Montessori, and she's also a positive discipline facilitator. After spending a decade teaching in Montessori classrooms, Pilar has begun homeschooling her own children back in 2019, and she has a real passion for making Montessori education accessible. And that inspired her to create Mainly Montessori, where she mentors parents who choose to homeschool using Montessori principles. So you can connect with her on Instagram or her website. I have the handle and the website URL in our show notes for you to be able to check that out and go follow Pilar. And Anna is a CGS catechist in all levels and a formation leader in all levels. She is a retired elementary Montessori guide and is retired coordinator of CGS at her parish in Charlotte, North Carolina. She also serves the National Association in many different ways, especially the Episcopal Committee and the Formation Advisory Committee. I hope you enjoy. Pilar and Anna, welcome to the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
Well, I am really excited to learn from both of you as elementary Montessorians and all of your wisdom and your experience with children of the second plane. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think that we talk a lot about the first plane child just naturally because I think it all, stems from them. But the second plane child is just a completely different being. And so I'm excited to give them more attention for us to really know how to be in front of that age child as well. So thank you both for being here with all of your wisdom.
It's a pleasure.
Yes.
So I want to start off with a Bible verse that really kind of ties in freedom and responsibility, freedom and discipline really well to kind of spur off our conversation. It comes from 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. And he says, "For God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline." With that in mind, I would love to hear from y'all about what Montessori's vision of discipline is, especially versus the culture's contemporary idea and understanding of discipline. What does that mean?
Absolutely. I think this scripture that you just shared really encapsulates what Dr. Montessori not just believed, but actually observed, that discipline is something that comes from the child. We all carry it. Mm-hmm. It has been endowed in us. And it's the work of the adult in the environment to foment that and allow that self-discipline to mature so that the child can then function with freedom and make the most of their time in that environment.
Right. Adding on to that, oftentimes we think of discipline as something that is being done to a child, something that is being enforced upon a child to bring forth a certain result or behavior, as opposed to a state of being that is being developed in the child.
Right. It's more of an internal
versus external. Mm-hmm.
Right. Or externally being pushed on you. It's more of an internal growth and decision inside of myself.
Right.
A muscle inside of myself that I'm growing
in. What comes from outside is not true discipline, and it's not going to develop that self-discipline. It is only going to lead to the child trying to avoid making the adult angry or avoid getting caught or those kinds of behaviors, but it's not going to lead to a child who acts correctly because they understand the value of acting correctly. And so I think this whole conversation of freedom and independence, those qualities can only come about if we as adults understand this difference between the internal self-discipline and what society views or what we've been conditioned to believe is discipline.
Right. And sometimes we see what is understood to be an outward sign of discipline, especially in children, would be immobility and silence, being still and not talking. And instead of producing this internal discipline, instead it is often festering inside of child, arousing negative thoughts and even rebellious feelings.
Right. The internal deviations and external deviations that Dr. Montessori observed.
Right.
Like I'm thinking in my head about external, the tools in our tool bag on an external discipline,
Right.
timeouts, reward, consequences. Those are the outside person inflicting an outside discipline upon the child. And the inner discipline that Montessori is talking about is the person making a decision to put away their work, to walk around the rug, to do these things from an internal disposition. And I always think this is why whenever you remind the child of like a grace and courtesy, you walk away so that that's the difference between the two disciplines. Whether if I'm standing there and overseeing them, I'm inflicting the external discipline. But if I walk away, they get to make the decision themselves if they are going to apply that grace and courtesy.
Right. And that's such a great example of the freedom that the child is afforded in the classroom or in the environment.
Well, what about the words freedom and independence? Can you speak more into Montessori's view of even those words?
Yes, really interestingly, when I was reading chapter 12 in the book Nurturing the Whole Child, and the ideas of freedom and independence are explored there, but they're not one and the same. I think we often think in society, child who's independent is a child who has the freedom to do things by themselves. But really, freedom is not being given liberty to do whatever one wants. That's more license. Freedom is the ability to act in an environment where the child understands the limits, where the adult understands what the child needs, and not just what the child wants, but what they need developmentally. And when you bring those things together, then the child is supported to be able to really express their potential, to be able to act in a way that is going to lead them to be independent, to act independently, to make healthy choices, to take care of themselves, to take care of their environment, take care of their peers. But independence is like an outcome of freedom. Independence happens if we as adults can understand what the child needs, can create a supportive environment, can hold those limits, but also know when to step back, like you mentioned, Carrie. When all of that happens, then the child becomes truly independent, meaning that they can act by themselves in healthy ways. And it's a whole process, right? It doesn't happen overnight. It's a drawn out process where you see glimmers, and little by little, the child becomes more able to act independently.
A really concrete example of that would be if you have a piano in the room and the child has the choice, has the freedom to choose and to play the piano. Well, the limitation of that, though, is that the child has to develop an independence an independent skill of playing the piano in order to play the piano. So it's more than just the choice or the freedom to choose playing the piano, but the child has developed a skill that allows the independence of being able to play the piano. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. And I feel I like the way that y'all are both really emphasizing that this freedom and responsibility is a skill that has to be developed over time. And I feel like there is an equal skill that needs to be developed in the adult.
Right.
Because if the adult also doesn't learn how to have freedom with limits, or provide freedom with limits for the child, with the respect and dignity that is called for, it's almost impossible for the child to grow in this ability to have freedom and discipline and responsibility and independence.
Right.
So it's a two-edged thing that they both have to develop in order for this to exist.
Absolutely.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's not, I think sometimes if we look at it as a potential as opposed to something that just happens, there is a potential of it developing over time and based on not just one's experiences, but also on the physical and internal development of the person as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And because as for the adult side of it, our own personal experiences might not necessarily be conducive to true freedom.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
So we have to develop as a person, be willing to have that growth mindset to say, you know what, the tools in my tool bag are not necessarily conducive to this. So I need to learn a new way.
Right.
Than
That is spot on, because the children they are themselves. They haven't yet been as conditioned as we are. And so it really is the adult's responsibility to, in a sense, de-school themselves, understand how we've been conditioned, how we've been educated to see children's potential and to see the role of the adult. And then we need to wipe all that clean, wipe that slate clean, and start again, start with fresh eyes, which is what makes Montessori so powerful, right? That it is scientific in nature. And so while we have all of the observations that Dr. Montessori did and all of the, over 100 years of work that educators have done around the world, we are still called to use our own scientific observation to understand the children that we're working with and to understand where we become obstacles. And I think in the elementary years, because I know that the focus of this conversation is really the second plane, even though a lot of these topics are universal across the planes, but in the second plane, the children's behaviors can sometimes be very challenging because they are developing this intellectual independence, this desire to think by themselves. The first plane child, used to say, "Let me do it by myself." And the elementary child is now saying, "I want to think by myself. Let me think by myself." And so those tendencies of that child, which are healthy, they're developmentally healthy, but if we don't understand them appropriately, they can become triggers, or they can activate us and put us in a situation where we're not able to support that freedom and that independence.
Right. I think this is probably another issue within both parents and catechists is you get trained in level 1 and then you go up to level 2 and you're like, what is happening? This is a completely different beast. And it's true. Like you said, Pilar, they are completely different. And so again, we have to have that growth mentality that I need to learn who the 6 to 12-year-old child is in order for me to be able to create an environment that meets their needs.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay, so let's look at that. Who is the 6 to 12-year-old child? What are their developmental characteristics of this second plane?
In the first plane, our focus is really on freedom and limits because the child is learning the rules of their environment. Once we shift into the second plane, the balance becomes freedom and responsibility because the child now has a reasoning mind. And so they're able to see or gauge, evaluate right from wrong. They're able to understand what they are responsible for and how each one of those things that they're responsible for then affords a certain freedom, and vice versa. Every freedom comes with its own responsibility. So they're able to understand all of that. So we have to speak to that. And then again, they present as rude oftentimes, but it's because of this intellectual independence that they have. They also are always questioning right from wrong. So they might tattletale, they might point out things that you are doing wrong in their eyes or that you have said that shouldn't be done, but then they catch you doing them. So you have to be really careful how you behave around them because they're always watching you and learning from you. They can be a little bit messier than the first plane child because they've internalized that order from their external environment. And so now they are more goal-oriented than process-oriented like the primary child was. And so they want to get to the next thing and they want to start their project. And so they can tend to be a little bit messy. And they also start to abstract. So they start to understand the world more abstractly, more intellectually than concretely, where the first plane child was always working with their hands. And so it can be harder to notice when the second plane child is understanding, when they're learning, when they're mastering something, because you don't always have a window into their mind. So those are some of the characteristics that parents and educators working with elementary age children will encounter. And they're all developmentally appropriate.
Right.
Yeah.
But they can get yes. really messy.
And they rush and they, they don't pay attention to where they leave things. So, and that can be very agitating to adults who feel more at home in a first plane environment.
Right. Especially people who have, like Carrie said, who've recently had the level 1 course and they have really fallen in love with just that whole peaceful environment with such an intentional way of being in the space. I think sometimes when we walk into a level 1 atrium or a 3 to 6 Montessori classroom, you can almost feel your blood pressure just kind of dropping a few points, And then, but if we walk into a level 2 or level 3 atrium or elementary classroom, Montessori classroom, it's going to not only look different, it's going to sound different, but at the same time, it's not an anything goes environment.
Right. There are still rules and there are still guidelines and responsibilities. Absolutely.
They may not be as evident when you first walk in. It may take a little bit of time to put yourself in the environment and do a little more observing and to hear what is going on, because as has been said, that external order is being now replaced with a growing of an internal order. So it makes sense we won't be able to see it quite as obviously as you would with the first plane.
And also in the vein of the idea of freedom and limits and responsibility, really the only way that elementary children will take ownership of their environment and adhere to rules and guidelines is if they play a role in creating them. And that can be tricky for those of us who feel that the adults are still the ones who should be setting the rules, or if we really thrive on having a sense of control. And so when you first enter a second plane environment, sometimes the way things are done, if this is an established environment and the children do have the opportunity to take ownership over rules and guidelines, the way things are done are not necessarily how adults would do it. They might not be the most efficient ways of doing things, but they've been developed by the students, by the learners. That is how the child is developing that sense of responsibility, is by playing an important role in coming up with those guidelines.
I think if the people listening remember the podcast that Lynn Worthington and I did, we talked about establishing norms at the beginning of the year, each year, but allowing the children to set these norms. What kind of atrium do we want to have this year? And then the children come up with the ideas. And then how are we going to do this? How are we going to achieve your wishes? So that is coming from them. And so my Montessori career was primarily with the lower elementary, the 6 to 9-year-olds, and they always begin the year with like these draconian rules of the classroom that they want.
They are very strict with each other.
This is not the code of Hammurabi, and so with some gentle, I would always have so many rules. There's no way I can remember all these rules, so I would always be the one thinking, can we not make this simpler? Because the children that are in this plane of moral development, they are in such a strong period for justice, and they really they like justice. And so, as Pilar is saying, just allowing the children ownership of the space and way of being is key, and right from the beginning.
Okay, so letting them have a role in those rules and expectations, those freedoms and disciplines within your environment. What are some other things that you can do with a second plane child to nurture freedom and discipline with them?
Having group meetings and having one-on-one meetings can be very enlightening for the adult and very empowering for the child, because the child feels seen and heard and understood, and the adult gets that window into the child's mind that is not necessarily visible when you're observing an entire group of children. So for me, that has been one of the most effective principles and practices in my elementary career, both at home and in the classroom. And they don't need to be long, 5-minute conversations.
Yeah.
Right.
Nice. Thank you. I'm so glad that you pointed that out, because every time that I've thought about meetings like this, I've imagined a much more adult form, I think, in my head. But I like that they talk about that also in the positive discipline in the Montessori classroom. They talk about the group meetings and the individual meetings as a way to help with that. So that's
right.
That's
looking for solutions, not blame, and letting the children develop that way of looking. And oftentimes, being that the children are in this plane of social development with the moral development, oftentimes when it comes back down to tattling again, oftentimes as the adult, we hear the tattling and our first response that we may think is, oh, would you please stop tattling? And then, but sometimes we also feel like the child is asking us to intervene or to do something or to dole out a consequence to the offender. And in actuality, oftentimes what the child is asking us as the adult in the situation, what is the rule here? Is it okay to say that or not?
Right.
I'm not trying to blame anybody or get anybody in trouble. I'm looking to you as the one to tell me that is okay or that is not okay.
So then how do you as the adult respond when a child comes to you with quote unquote tattling, when really what they're asking is that okay what that kid is doing? What do you say?
In our, whether it's if it's at home, you say in our family, we don't do that. Or in our atrium, we do not take paper away from each other. We do not take another person's seat. Or if it's something, I was getting ready to take a book and that person got it before I did. Well, that might be okay. Did he know you wanted the book? That could be, a discussion that we have, that it hurt your feelings, maybe, but it could be okay. So that is the part that children this age struggle with is moving from that right or wrong, left or right, black or white view of the world and looking at sometimes the rules of our culture or change according to the context. What we do in the atrium might be different than what you do at home. At home, you might be allowed to have candy. We're not going to have candy. It's a really silly one, but you know what I'm saying, that
Right.
they even start to see that the limits can vary according to where the activity is taking place. They can also begin to see that sometimes the limits to one's freedom or the rules or whatever we want to call them, the norms, are even limited to a degree according to the individual.
Yes.
And that can be a tough one. You let him do that. Why can't I do it? But that is helping the child to begin to see the fruits of self-discipline.
Right. And it's a 6-year process, right? This plane, this
right. We're not talking about the 6-year-old.
Exactly.
Here,
And I think
are we?
it's really important to highlight that the 6-year-old exhibits these characteristics, but they don't have the maturity to reflect yet. That maturity comes with time. And so this plane of development spans 6 years. And it really isn't until they're 9, 10, 11 that everything starts to solidify and they start to really be able to see the nuances, to see the grays instead of the blacks and whites.
And I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, for this age child, they need to understand, like you have to explain, okay, so why don't we eat candy in the atrium?
Absolutely.
And because they can't just accept, it is not in their characteristics or who they are at this age to accept, okay, we don't eat candy. And this, again, silly example, but it's black and white. So, but to explain why this or that, and helps them to be able to accept and to move, like you said, from the black and white to the gray. Like imagine like the 6, 7-year-old to be like, I don't know if I agree with you on this one. But then as you move up a little bit older and after being explained to a few times, they start to, okay, I see how this is okay for him in this situation.
Absolutely.
It's a little different now.
Yeah. I always say that the best thing about a second plane child is that you can explain why. And the hardest thing about the second plane child is that you have to explain why. They do not accept you at face value.
I love that, Pilar. I love that.
Yeah, they are fascinating.
It's true. They do better, though, when you explain, okay, why can't I go play my game? Why can't I go to my friend's house? Why can't we have this for dinner again? Whatever. I'm thinking about my home life right now. When you explain the why, they accept it so much better. For a second plane child does.
When we're explaining why, though, we don't have to really go on and on about it. I'm still a short and simple explanation that we can expand upon if we need to, in conversation. But sometimes a very short and concise reason is showing that you've thought about it, that you have a reason. And giving the reason is not shutting the child down, dismissing the child's concern or thoughts or ideas.
So maybe validating first, being like, I totally understand that you want spaghetti tonight, but the rest of the family doesn't, since we just had it last night, and so we're not having.
we didn't make spaghetti.
Right. That's where the collaborative problem solving comes in, because then you can say, "Oh, I hear that you love having spaghetti for dinner. Would you like to work with me on meal planning next week, or would you like to bring this up at family meeting or at group meeting, and come up with a solution where everybody gets a day to choose, or whatever the case may be." That's very empowering to the second plane child, and that's something that you can't do with the first plane child. They're not there yet until they're maybe 5 or 6. They start to be able to understand that. But it's the best thing that you can do with a second plane child. It gives them that sense of belonging and significance. And then it becomes a lot easier to work with them. They're so much more willing to accept that things aren't always going to go their way if they know that they have a voice and that their voice matters and will be heard.
Mm-hmm. Right. That goes back to that positive discipline, like they were talking about. When they don't feel one of those things, belonging or significance, that's when the deviations start to happen. Or maybe deviations isn't the right word, but that's when you start to see the misbehavior because they're responding to a lack of feeling belonging.
I think calling it a deviation is we can do that. That's valid.
And I'm curious because I'm not very familiar with how the atrium works, but I'm curious how the setup where it's only 1 or 2 days a week or a couple of hours a week, how that would impact the child's ability to feel a sense of significance and belonging.
Well, it certainly is different than a traditional Montessori class where especially elementary class where the children are coming all day, every day, or 5 days a week. And when we are doing one session per week for 2 hours. So from a content point of view, we are narrowing our focus instead of the full complement of all the Montessori lessons and materials and so forth. We are narrowing the focus to a very specific part of the work. But I think your question, Pilar, is talking more about how do we live this life together in the community of the atrium.
How do you foster that freedom and that independence? Right.
I think it adds to a challenge that is not there when we do have them more often. And the children, it becomes their lived reality when most of their waking day is spent in a community that is doing that. But on the other hand, I don't think we throw our hands up in the air and say, well, we really don't have them long enough to nurture this. I think most of us have found that we have observed these behaviors in children. And it's oftentimes, there are other influences happening at the same time. Perhaps children could even be going to a Montessori school, but probably not if we look at our whole community of catechesis of the Good Shepherd, the children that attend. But sometimes the families are using a progressive way of being with the children at home, or other schools that are offering a similar way of being, say with the positive discipline and some of the other ideas that we have talked about, or perhaps we will offer as a resource. I think most of all, though, when we even do it 2 hours a week, it points to the fact that this is actually a natural way for children to be, and that children respond to the dignity that is being offered to them by respecting their natural laws of developing will, developing self-discipline, by allowing them to have that freedom and then ultimately that independence. That they respond to that in a way that even makes it possible for a very short period of time in the child's otherwise busy life for it to make a difference. And the other thing I will add briefly, and then we're going to come back to this, I think, toward the end, is I think sometimes the content of what we're offering the children helps to nurture that as well. This idea of falling in love and being in love with Jesus, the Good Shepherd, and the kingdom of God is a place where I want to be. This whole idea of living together in the kingdom, I think, is another piece that we would not get in a non-secular classroom.
I have never been in a full Montessori 5 days a week environment, so I wouldn't be able to compare to that. But what I have seen in a level 2, level 3 atrium, I think it probably does take them longer, like a few more weeks of the 2-week sessions weekly for them to kind of get into the groove of living into this community and with the freedom and discipline that's allowed to them in this space. But it does happen probably sooner than what you would typically expect. But I also see that because they're typically coming from most likely like a public school, a traditional type schooling setting into this unique environment, there's like a period of time at the very beginning of each session that it's almost like they need to transition also. Mm-hmm. But as the year progresses, they also kind of enter into this space. It's like their body is ready for it, conditioned for it, like welcoming to it. It's like coming into a retreat.
Right. It's like they need it and they crave it.
Yes. It's like, this is the only place I'm going to come where there is respect and peace and dignity, like to the degree that is offered in this type of space. And so they crave it, I think, also. So it's unique. It's unique. You would think it would almost not make sense, but it definitely works.
Another piece that I see happening with the children in the atrium compared to children in a Montessori classroom is that, and especially as the children get older, I think their ideas of engagement are shaped by being in school. And I'll give you like 2 examples. One, and I'm thinking of this in more than 9 to 12, oftentimes asking a question and kind of just asking that wondering question and kind of letting it just live, living into the question, as Rumi would say. And oftentimes there's not a living into the question because there is a pause and they're waiting for me to answer my own question. So I have noticed that children oftentimes think the adult will, if they don't say anything, will just answer the question. And then this is a little bit of a humorous one. Once we were working with level 3 materials and presentation on the sacraments in the Holy Bible. So we were using that material and we were trying to think about the explanations of each sacrament, and we were matching it to the frames for the level 3 people. You know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And one child said, "Whoa, this is kind of confusing. I'm glad there's not a test." and then one of the other children in the class said, "Oh, don't you know those Montessori teachers don't believe in tests?"
Well, how wonderful that it's an environment where they can feel safe, and especially because they're exploring their spirituality and their connection to God, and that should be a nurturing space, a space with freedom, right? With true freedom.
Yeah, freedom not to even answer a question.
To ask it or not,
to
let our silence answer it. Yes.
Yeah, right. And then our silence can be our response even, but allowing that space.
But I would say that if we could get more parents to have more of the formation, like what we're talking about with freedom and responsibility, or even just all going to formation, even if you don't feel called to be a catechist, I do think that it would help the seeds that are planted in the atrium to continue to be watered in your everyday life. So of course that's a goal. But what about that though? So how can we as adults grow and change so that we can create these types of environments with freedom and responsibility and that respect that we're talking about?
I think for me, in my experience, a lot of the work had to do with reflecting on how I was raised, what I believed to be true as a child, and then really stepping back and observing my children, noticing what they needed and how different it was from how I was brought up. And so it was a combination of understanding Montessori and the principles and everything that Dr. Montessori had observed, but also not taking it as the truth, but really doing my own work. So in a sense, asking, okay, is this true? Is it true that children need this? Is it true that children are capable of this? Is it true that an adult can relate to children in this way? And then just trying it and seeing how different my relationship became with my students or with my own children when I was able to let go. So it's a lot of, for me, it was a lot of self-reflection, a lot of journaling, a lot of forgiving my parents, my teachers, my society, my culture, and myself. Absolutely. Exactly. And creating a role and a way of being that was true to what my children needed and to what I needed, not what society said was appropriate.
Right. And Montessori herself did this. She talked about an examination of her own conscience and how she did that regularly.
Yes, because it is a regular practice. It's not a one and done deal.
Right.
It's ongoing because our children continue to grow and change and move into the next plane of development. So you have to understand them in a completely different way.
Another thing that we've talked about, it's tied into the challenges of the 2-hour once a week session, but it also can be a challenge in a regular Montessori classroom. Once again, related to the child himself, the children themselves that are louder, messier, and so forth. Sometimes there can be, it might look like chaos because it is. And what do we do about that where, the children are not engaging with the materials? They may even be harming the materials. We are to stop that. That is not something that we allow to happen. There's an anecdote from one of Montessori's books about in the early days when she was visiting one of the Montessori schools doing an observation of one of the teachers in the classroom. She said a child actually opened the window and climbed out the window, and the guide did absolutely nothing. And so Montessori, you can just imagine her, putting down her clipboard with her beautiful dress on and climbing out the window.
Yeah.
And going after the child. And later, paraphrasing here, what were you thinking? The teacher says, I was doing as I'm instructed. I'm doing as I've been taught. I was following the child. And Montessori said, you don't follow the child off a cliff. Just as there are limits to individual freedoms, there's also limits to a collective freedom of what is the environment of a class or of an atrium. What would you say about that, Pilar?
Absolutely. I think there's two pieces. One is we don't interrupt productive work, right? Once we see that a child has connected with a material, with an activity, we don't interrupt that. But we must never be afraid to stop the evil, in Dr. Montessori's words. Stop the evil.
Right.
And another anecdote from when the first casas were emerging, I was a visitor that went to observe, and she asked one of the little children, "Oh, is this the school where you do as you want, as you like?" And the child said, this was a small primary child, he said, "We don't do as we like, but we like what we do." Isn't that powerful, right? That I think sums up this freedom and independence when you have provided the right balance of limits and freedom. It's not liberty. It's not let the child do whatever they want. It's not impose adult restrictions to keep total control of the environment. It's that middle ground. And it's tricky. Freedom and responsibility is always shifting. You give some freedom to the child so that they can practice and then you see how they're able to handle that freedom. And then sometimes you have to kind of rein it back in a little bit, offer those firm, kind, respectful, but very firm limits, and allow the child to understand why those limits are in place. And it just goes back and forth until the child develops the maturity and the awareness to understand that it's in the best interest of the entire community that we all follow the guidelines. And in AMI, the symbol of AMI, which is the certification, is the foundation that Dr. Montessori left to further her work. The symbol of AMI is 3 concentric circles. And during training, we were explained that we can view our environment our students in terms of those 3 circles. The smallest circle are the children who cannot handle freedom yet. They're the children that need our guidance, need our support. And so we need to keep them close to us. We need to engage them, keep them close to us, make them our helpers. Then the second circle are those children that are starting to be able to handle freedom responsibly. And so we give them more space. And then that third circle are those children that are normalized, those children that have really internalized the balance of freedom and responsibility and can work really independently. They're the ones that can be the farthest away from you because they can function. They've reached that next level of independence. So hopefully that visual can help the adults working in those environments.
Absolutely.
I love the 3 circles. Claire Paglia, she talked about it in the last episode, and I have never had that visual before. I love it. That is so, so helpful, the 3 circles.
The other thing I think we need to mention in having this discussion is the power of real and purposeful work when we're talking about the development of self-discipline and such. Of course, chapter 14 in Nurturing the Whole Child speaks to that. And I know we've done other podcasts specifically on the child's work. I just turned to chapter 14 right now and came upon this quote from Gianna Gobbi, and she's actually quoting Montessori now that I look at it. She's talking about the phenomenon of the work of a child that becomes like the work of a scientist. When this happens, work becomes fascinating and irresistible and raises a man above his deviated self. He possesses an extraordinary power and experiences again that natural instinct that enables him to express his own individuality. This instinct is like a powerful stream that gushes forth from the earth and provides refreshment from humankind. So this kind of work helps to form the person, helps to form the child. And I say that in just having these 2 scenarios in your mind of walking into a space where some of the children are walking into the atrium and they know that they should be doing something or they want to be doing something. They don't know quite what it is that they should do. They might walk around. Some of the children might choose a material they've worked with before. But oftentimes what happens is, or sometimes what happens is, I shouldn't say often, but I'm just thinking about when people come for advice, that time. The children are taking paper and pencil and colored pencils and that sort of thing. And oftentimes it just becomes a little bit of a busy work type session that then can lead to other things. Whereas when children enter the space with purpose and are given presentations that are springboard to work for new ideas, and new ideas spark new ideas with elementary children, the way, this power of the intellect guided by the imagination and all, the way they collaborate with each other, the way they have the herd instinct going on, that work and making sure the children are being given presentations. As Sophia has said before, when we want to make sure that we are giving the children something to respond to.
Mm-hmm.
Then if we wanted to think about more about when we're looking at something to respond to, if we look at some of the areas that the children work with that are unique to Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, as opposed to a traditional Montessori classroom, we are offering them presentations in scripture and liturgy, and then moving into work with this idea that the kingdom of God not only is here and inside of us, but has a history and has yet to be fulfilled. Some of these areas, I think we could even explore this a little more fully, and some of the readers or some of the listeners might be interested in doing this. But that some of the areas and themes of catechesis that appeal to this age child can nurture a spiritual freedom, discipline, and independence. And once again, that chapter that on page 91 of Nurturing the Whole Child, when we talk about the child's work and cosmic work, I keep referring to it because it's my favorite chapter, I guess. but even if we look back at, even at the very beginning, when we look at level 1, we are giving the children the foundations of the kingdom of God as a place of mystery, as a place of transformation, a place of joy. We are giving them an image of God that is grounded in the love of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. But we're just not giving it to them. We are putting them in charge of that relationship, even at the age of level 1. So even though the child's not reading yet, we are giving the child a material that allows them to touch and feel, have a very sensorial experience that will give them a discipline or the groundwork of the discipline to be able to do reading and exegesis of scripture as they get older. So that pattern of first listening to the word and then going back and reflecting on and meditating on and asking questions. What could it be about this pearl that would cause so much joy? What could, these questions, that becomes a lifelong, or it can become a lifelong practice. That is a huge freedom.
I love that.
It's really beautiful.
And then the morality, moving into the level 2 and 3, the second plane child, moving into those levels of atrium of catechesis, the moral aspect that develops because the child who is hearing the parables is now hearing them from a place of growing morality. The very same kingdom of God parable that the child heard in level 1, say the pearl of great price, when they were meditating upon the beauty and the rarity of the pearl, now becomes a little bit more about what the pearl merchant had to do. So we're moving into more the actions. But the thing is, it is still about, even though it is moving into a moral sphere, as Pilar mentioned a while ago, the child is not self-reflecting yet. So when people say, what about the pearl merchant? He had to give it all, give up the house, give up the table. It's about the pearl merchant, though. So that's why it's easy to say, give it up, give it up. But then as the child moves into level 3 and the child turns that very same parable on himself, ooh, what is this parable saying to me? And so we see developing here what we know about these parables is that within the kerygma of the parable, there is paranesis. There is a moral imperative,
Mhm.
but it is not until the child is hearing it with those ears that they hear that moral piece, and that morality is still also grounded in love. So adding to that the maxims of Jesus, when we're hearing these great truths that complement the parables, or even more so, looking at the summary of the law, how to love God, to love your neighbor as yourself. Hearing and talking about these and meditating upon and working with this work together is helping to shape a morality that is in tandem with developing the self-discipline. When we look at this idea of what Montessori referred to as cosmic task, and in the catechesis, Pilar, we use the term writing the blank page. In the search for cosmic task, what is my contribution to this life? This search for cosmic task becomes a discipline as well, or I think it can.
Right. And it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, where it's motivated internally rather than externally.
Exactly.
Right. So if you live your life under this kind of like this, there's this undercurrent in your life of how do I contribute? What do I do? How do I express gratitude?
And there's no right or wrong answer to these things because it's different for each person.
Right.
Right.
So, and again, seeing even the laws of nature that, we bring it out again with the very youngest children that, a mustard seed grows a mustard shrub, not a pine tree, and then when moving into level 3, seeing that even the sun, even the moon, even the planets, they all have a set of rules and they follow them.
I love that. That's really beautiful,
It
Anna.
is wonderful.
Takes us full circle back to really why it is that we're doing what we're doing. Well, thank you both. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Pilar, I really enjoyed getting to know you on via this mode, but maybe one day in person.
I really do. Thank you. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom. And Carrie, thank you for bringing us together. This was lovely.
Yes, it really was. Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast. So in our show notes, you can find many things to aid you on your journey to discovering more about freedom and responsibility. This subject is so big, you can just keep learning about it. So there I have where you can connect with Pilar. I also have some books to help you grow, especially Nurturing the Whole Child, which we've referred to many times throughout these conversations. And the book Positive Discipline in the Montessori Classroom, I put a link for that in our show notes as well. We also have Carolyn Colehouse, who is a Montessori guide as well as a CGS catechist and formation leader. She has written many online articles on her platform, The Wandering of Sheep in the Atrium, that specifically talk about freedom and limits. So I put links to that series of articles in our show notes so that you can read that. There's also some podcast episodes that you might be interested, some that have to do with freedom and responsibility, and some that we've had Anna on the podcast before. Also in our show notes, we have a list of how you can follow the United States Association of the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd on many platforms, such as Facebook, on Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, and on YouTube. So if you would like to go and follow us, check out our show notes for what all of the handles are for each of those social media platforms. This podcast is sponsored by the United States Association of the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. If you would like to know more about the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, or if you would like to become a member, please go to cgsusa.org. Thank you all for listening. We will see you in 2 weeks. Go and fall more deeply in love with God.